The book our group decided to read was The Maze Runner by James Dashner. When looking at the plot starts off with a boy named Thomas who wakes up in an elevator and has no recollection of anything but his own name. The elevator brings him into the glade, which is the setting of the book where they live, which is inside a maze. Thomas then comes to realize that the other boys within the glade don't have memories either. Thomas is introduced to Albie and Newt, who run the glade. They explain the glade to him and how everything works there, including roles within the glade and job positions.
The boys that found themselves without memory upon entering the glade spend time trying to get through the maze to escape. They're known as the runners. Within the maze, if you get stung by one of the grievers, you retrieve some of your memory back. And Thomas, who was attacked by one of them, gets his memory back and realizes that he used to work with the creators of the glade.
Thomas knew right away that he wanted to be a runner. This becomes important as he leads the change to everyone around the maze. A girl, Teresa, enters the glade for the first time. Upon Teresa's arrival, bizarre things begin to happen within the maze that had never happened before. For example, the doors to the maze begin to stay open all night, making it easier for the monstrous grievers to enter. Teresa also arrives with a letter saying that she is going to be the last one to ever enter the maze. Thomas finds out that he knew Teresa before they entered the maze, and they start to communicate telepathically.
Another big scene that happened shortly after Teresa entered the maze was Albie, their leader. He went into the maze when he found out one of the grievers had been killed, and he went to check it out, and he ended up getting stung by it, and this made it a lot more difficult to get him out of the maze. So one of the runners, Minho, really struggled to get him out of the maze, and he got really close, but as the doors were closing, he realized they weren't going to make it, and Thomas ran in to get them, and Thomas and Minho and Albie managed to survive the maze that night, and they were the first people to ever do that. And based on that decision, they decided to make Thomas a runner. What they also learned from that is that when you get stung by a griever, you get some of your memories back, which they had thought they lost for good. So with that being known, later on in the book, Thomas, when trying to discover a way out of the maze, decides to get himself stung by a griever. And by doing this, he realized that in order to get out, you need codes. And to do this, because the maze moves, he checked out, they looked at the history of all the different patterns of the maze, and they were able to come to conclusions with what the words were that would be the code to get out. And so when they figured out the words for the code, they got everyone together and they ran a charge to get out of the maze until they eventually got through the exit, which they found from his memories, and they realized that this whole place was run by some creators called Wicked.
One of the main characters within the story is Thomas, who along with Newt and Minho is the driving force in getting everyone out of the maze. Thomas butts heads with the character Golly because Golly knows who Thomas really is. Thomas, as previously mentioned, communicates using telepathy with Teresa. Thomas discovers that the maze spells out words and uses the words to help them escape the maze.
Another main character is Teresa, who is the only girl to ever enter the glade. And though the other boys look down on her, Teresa works extremely well with Thomas, and she is a main component to them escaping. And she handles herself very well and is confident. I think the fact that there's only one female character in this book speaks to woman empowerment, because this book had a lot of action, solving, and gave off a masculine feel, but the fact that a female was included and played a pivotal role made it less masculine.
Another main character is Chuck, and Chuck's the youngest person in the maze. He's also Thomas's first friend, and because Thomas was the new person, Chuck was just the new person before that. They built a friendship off of that, and as the book went on, Thomas came to look at Chuck as a little brother, and he even went as far as to make a promise to Chuck that he'd get him home to his parents. And when Chuck eventually dies at the end of the movie, it was really emotional. Or end of the book, it was a really emotional scene.
Gally, who is the antagonist to Thomas, gets stung by one of the grievers and regains some of his memory, which is why he really dislikes Thomas. Gally is one of the only ones that doesn't think they should try to escape, because Gally sees the glade to be better than what his life was in the real world.
Newt is the second as far as runners go. for who's in charge in the glade. After Albie gets stung looking at the dead Griever, he becomes the leader. He embraces the role as a leader and is the one who gives the rest of the runners speeches upon going into the maze. And the assumption can be made that he is British or somewhat from the UK because of his frequent use of the word bloody.
Albie, he was the first person ever to enter the glade, and he had to live there alone for a month by himself. He was in charge of everyone. Everyone kind of went to him for like rules, and he collectively kept the group together as a whole until like midway through the book when he got stung by one of the Grievers, which kind of took a big toll on him emotionally and mentally, and physically. So when that happened, he kind of took over his role to Newt.
Minho was another one of the first people to enter the glade. He is the leader of the runners, which also makes him one of the strongest, smartest, and fastest people in the glade. He is one of the first ones to side with Thomas, although likely because Thomas was the one who ran into the maze when he was trapped and helped him make it through the night. From this point on, he was a big fan of Thomas, taking his side when Thomas initially wanted to be a runner, as well as when Thomas was trying to convince everyone that they had to leave the maze. Minho even suggested at one point that Thomas himself become the leader of the runners.
A major theme in the story is the importance of teamwork. Teamwork is the basis of what keeps the glade running and everything in order. The characters in the story stress how everyone needs to do their job for the best of the collective unit, and by doing this, they will be able to live peaceful and orderly. A different element of teamwork comes about when Thomas and the others ultimately decide that they need to leave the maze. This required them to work as a team against the Grievers when they came into their home every night, to work as a team when they saw the maps and figure out the code, and to work as a team to fight off the Grievers and escape through the Griever hole. Without teamwork, nothing that Thomas or anyone else in the story had accomplished could have been possible.
Another major theme within the story was overcoming disadvantages. In the beginning of the story, Thomas is placed in the glade with no memory and a difficulty to communicate with the other boys. The other boys seem to be speaking a weird language and have their own set of vocabulary that Thomas needs to learn in order to navigate the maze. However, in the end, Thomas overcomes all the disadvantages that were placed against him, as he was the one who ultimately figured out the code to break out of the maze. So, did you guys have any favorite quotes in the story?
Yeah, one quote on page 195. Thomas stood up to pace around the little room, fuming with an intense desire to keep his promise. I swear, Chuck, he whispered to no one. I swear I'll get you back home. This is an important quote because it's a constant reminder of the reason why Thomas is so determined to get everyone out of the maze. He felt a connection with Chuck. It was the first person he got a friendship with in the glade, and since then he's looked out for him like a little brother. And one emotional scene between Chuck and Thomas was when Chuck was telling Thomas if he thought his family was even thinking about him or missed him. And from that point on, Thomas made it his job to get Chuck out of the maze and ultimately get him to reunite with his family.
Yeah, I have one too. It's on page 265. It was said by Minho. He said, "Someone burned all the maps. If there was a code, it's gone." And this was an interesting quote because at the time it was said, it like really looked like they lost their only way out of the maze. But this wasn't like completely right because earlier in the day, Newt and Thomas had hid the maps and in like a different location because they're trying to protect themselves from the Grievers who had been attacking ever since the maze's doors were open. So while Minho said this to the whole group, he didn't want to give everyone the impression that they had hid the maps and gone against the rules. So once they met together with the other leaders, they broke the news that they actually still had the maps and then that the plan was really still in action. So this was just like a nice cliffhanger to end a chapter, but it wasn't completely accurate.
So what are your guys' opinion on the book?
I thought my initial reaction was like that it reminded me of the Hunger Games because both are about like environments being constructed by like some creator and then watching those placed in the environment struggle to make it out. And I think that like there's also like manipulation of environments and seeing how people like deal with it and react to it.
I personally really liked how in the beginning of the book there was a lot of ambiguity involved. We didn't really know who the main character Thomas was or where he was. However, as the story goes on, we can see how much is actually involved in the maze and the struggle that the Gladers went through to get through the maze. I also enjoyed how Thomas was able to overcome all of his challenges to become the hero of the story.
I thought it was a really well done book. It kind of hit everything that you need in like a really good book. Like it had an antagonist in Golly, and he kind of like created conflict for Thomas throughout the book. It put Teresa into the plot at a nice point. It kind of sped it up and really itched them towards getting out of the maze. And then there are various relationships, like the one between Chuck and Thomas, which really appealed to the audience's feelings. And then there was like a humorous relationship between Thomas and Minho as they were like always on each other. And then like a little bit of an emotional relationship between Teresa and Thomas because there was always something about them where they felt like they had known each other from before. So it always just kind of kept the reader interested and definitely made it a good read.
I definitely agree with all your points you guys made overall. I would really recommend the book to anyone looking for an action-packed thriller. It was overall a great book.
Agreed.